Donald Trump made what he did a campaign promise. He was clear about where he stood. He was proud of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. He made this very clear on January 7th, 2021. Anyone pretending to be outraged and shocked and surprised, you just haven't been paying attention.
That, of course, is Harry Dunn. Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. Donald Trump's first administration began with one of his top aides claiming that there are such things on this earth as alternate facts. And now he begins his second with a complete and utter whitewashing of a truth we all saw play out over many hours with our own eyes on every station of television in this country, and that is the insurrection, when a mob of his supporters angrily and violently stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th. Trump's immediate pardoning of the nearly 1,600 January 6 defendants, sending a clear message that, in his view, no one did anything wrong. But there are some who are making sure that the history of that day, the facts of that day, are not erased. The federal judges who oversaw the trials and sentencing of the insurrectionists. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell writes in a new order that Trump's administration's move to dismiss these cases is wrong. Regarding the case of two defendants who pleaded guilty to throwing smoke bombs at officers, she writes this, quote, "No national injustice occurred here, just as no outcome determinative election fraud occurred in the 2020 presidential election. No process of national reconciliation can begin when poor losers whose preferred candidate loses an election are glorified for disrupting a constitutionally mandated proceeding in Congress and doing so with impunity." And Judge Howell is not alone. A stunning rebuke of the Trump administration's pardons coming from Judge Tanya Chutkan as well. She's the judge overseeing Donald Trump's own election interference case before it was dismissed. Listen to her words as we watch what happened that day from the point of view of officers' body cameras. What Donald Trump and the Republican Party are trying to tell you never even happened. Quote, "While a pardon exercises the executive's exclusive authority and absolute discretion to decide whether to prosecute a case, it does not necessarily render innocent a defendant of any alleged violation of the law. More broadly, no pardon can change the tragic truth of what happened on January 6, 2021. On that day, a mob professing support for then-President Trump violently attacked the United States Capitol to stop the Electoral College certification. The dismissal of this case cannot undo the rampage that left multiple people dead, injured more than 140 people, and inflicted millions of dollars in damage. It cannot diminish the heroism of law enforcement officers who struggled, facing serious injury and even death, to control the mob that overwhelmed them. It cannot whitewash the blood, feces, and terror that the mob left in its wake. And it cannot repair the jagged breach in America's sacred tradition of peacefully transitioning power. In hundreds of cases like this one over the past 4 years, judges in this district have administered justice without fear or favor. The historical record established by these proceedings must stand, unmoved by political winds, as a testament and as a warning. That was Judge Tanya Chutkan writing. The revisionism effort reaching a whole new level this morning. Former Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone, friend of this show, who suffered a heart attack and a traumatic brain injury after being brutally attacked by rioters, told our colleague Ryan Riley that he spoke with his victim service advocates at DOJ, trying to get restraining orders against the rioters who nearly killed him. The service advocates, he said, refused to give him information on his assailants that would help him secure those restraining orders, telling him that from the new perspective of the new Justice Department, quote, "You are no longer a victim." That's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner is here. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman's here. And my colleague, NBC News justice reporter, author of Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System, Ryan Riley's back. Ryan, you had that reporting on Michael Fanone. Tell us more.
Yeah, he gave me a call this morning to inform me of that conversation. And, I think there's two things here, Under the way this process typically works is that when DOJ has these victims, these are victim service advocates. So they accompany them to court, the 6 different hearings, the sentencing hearings that Mike Fanone has attended, the last and final one of which he attended on Friday when I accompanied him to the courthouse. They've been there alongside him. They've been with him. And under their protocols, when there's an active case or when there's an ongoing case, that's when they are helping the victims in that case. And that applies to any case, not just with officers, with any of the cases that the Justice Department prosecutes and the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutes. But now that those cases are over and they have dismissed them. In fact, the Justice Department has tried to dismiss those cases with prejudice under the leadership of the interim U.S. attorney who advocated for January 6 defendants before he was appointed to this position and served on the board of an organization which advocated for January 6 defendants and spoke at the Capitol before the January 6 attack on January 5th himself, has been trying to move for those dismissals with prejudice. So they are trying to kill these cases. They are trying to kill, I think, the history of it. And when you talk about them telling Mike Fanone, you are no longer a victim, even though in their that sort of makes sense why they would say that in their category, because under their process he is no longer a victim. You can't help but hear the really Orwellian language there, right? Like, you are no longer a victim. It's just this revisionism of history, I think, that we're trying to see that there's just a ton of right now.
Glenn, Judge Tanya Chutkan, she clearly was writing on the specifics, but also for history. A real warning from her.
Yeah, I know her courtesy of trying murder cases against her years ago in the courts of Washington, D.C., when she was a public defender and a really remarkable public defender. I would say she was a worthy adversary. I hope I was a worthy adversary as a homicide prosecutor to Tanya Chutkan. But I take all of this that's going on with these pardons really personally. Now, not as personally as Harry Dunn, Mike Fanone, Aquilino Gonell, Daniel Hodges, Caroline Edwards, and the 135 other police officers who were attacked and beaten and assaulted, who I guess the Department of Justice believes are no longer victims. But I take it personally because I know the prosecutors who investigated and prosecuted these cases. I had the opportunity to cover the trials for MSNBC as a legal analyst, the Oath Keepers trials, the Proud Boys trials, and I would watch my former colleagues, many of whom were my homicide prosecutors when I was chief of homicide at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. Several were my trial partners. I tried murder cases with some of these prosecutors. And to see Donald Trump, who thinks he can just with the stroke of a pen whitewash all of this, it's so disrespectful of not just the victims, first and foremost the victims, but all of the FBI agents and investigators who investigated these crimes, all of the prosecutors and the staff at the U.S. Attorney's Office that was involved in 1,500 prosecutions, the grand juries, which, Nicole, I don't think we have paid enough attention to the grand juries that sat behind closed doors confidentially and heard all of the evidence for all 1,500 plus of the defendants who ultimately went to court, many of them, if not most of them, pleading guilty. Do you know we run about 5 to 7 grand juries at a time in the courts of Washington, D.C. That's both local superior court and federal court. But because of our unusual jurisdiction, those grand juries cross-pollinate. So the local grand juries can indict federal cases and the federal grand juries can indict local cases. And do you know, if a grand jury indicts 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 cases, that is 16 to 23 individuals, citizens from the District of Columbia, who sit there for months and months hearing all of the evidence in those 10, 15, 20 cases. multiply that by 1,500 cases. You know, the District of Columbia population is only about 680,000. How many tens of thousands of grand jurors sat in those, you know, closed door grand jury sessions from 9:30 in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon, watching all of the evidence and hearing from all of the witnesses and the victims of what these defendants did at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And those thousands and thousands of people must be asking themselves, what was my grand jury service for? What was it worth? I mean, the sort of not only the danger to society that these pardons represent, but the undermining, the corrosive effect of what Donald Trump has just done. I mean, it spreads far and wide in ways that I don't even know we can fathom at this moment.
Harry Litman, it's going to play out before our very eyes because whereas 3 months ago, Donald Trump was a candidate for president, aligning himself with the insurrectionists, he's now a sitting president who just pardoned people convicted of committing the violent crimes of assaulting police officers. In the words of Hakeem Jeffries, violent felons who brutally beat police officers on January 6th. What does that mean for efforts to fight against violence moving forward?
It's a body blow. I think it's galling, repugnant, really the worst betrayal of the Constitution by any president in our history. I agree with everything Glenn says, itemizing the victims. But the number one victim here, I really think, and this is what makes it so pernicious, is society, the Constitution, the general principle, as Judge Chutkan emphasized, of the peaceful transfer of power. That was a direct assault that, as you say, Nicole, we all saw, and that is now, again, in Judge Chutkan's word, they're trying to whitewash away all the terror, feces, blood, and the like.